Of the 4.5 billion years our planet has existed, life has only been around for about 3.8 billion years, and much of that time there were only invisible to the naked eye microorganisms that were relatively simple in form and function. As time marched on, as it always does, more complex organisms evolved and would eventually become the living organisms we see today in their present and fossilized forms. A living organism is classified as consisting of at least one cell. That cell is going to be the smallest functional unit of life, and it's so small, in fact, it can't be seen with the naked eye. Humans didn't even know they existed until the mid-1600s when Robert Hooke invented the very first microscope. Once we had that new technology, and even more technology, to be able to observe the microscopic world, everything changed. We would soon discover that microorganisms live all around us. They live on us, and they even live inside of us. As time progressed and our tools for observing the microscopic world became better and more detailed, we can now observe all the way down to the genetic level and get an even more accurate picture of how organisms are related. When we look at any living cell or a living organism, we start by putting them into one of two general groupings. They're either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. This separation is the first way we begin to divide the living world into distinct categories based on their natural characteristics. Classification helps us better understand the complexity of life and makes it way easier for scientists to be able to discuss large groups of organisms while comparing and contrasting their similarities as well as their differences. If there is a membrane-bound true nucleus that houses DNA, then we're going to call that cell a eukaryote, or referred to as a eukaryotic cell. A cell is considered prokaryotic or a prokaryote if it lacks a true nucleus, meaning it does not contain a membrane-bound structure in its cell that houses its genetic material responsible for carrying the instructions of how to live and reproduce. For prokaryotes, the genetic material is going to be in the form of DNA or RNA, and it just kind of hangs around in the center of the cell in what we call the nucleoid region. Prokaryotes are smaller in size and less complex than eukaryotes, and although both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells have cytoplasm and a plasma membrane, it's only the more complex eukaryotes that have the membrane-bound organelles that are each responsible for a very specific duty to help keep that cell alive. Although prokaryotes are much simpler in their form and function than eukaryotes, they're extraordinarily important to humans and our planet. Yes, it's true that some prokaryotes can be pathogenic, meaning that they have the potential to cause disease, but that is such a super tiny portion of all species of prokaryotes out there. For example, our own immunity, which influences our ability to stay healthy and fight off infection, is directly influenced by the good bacteria in our body and on our skin. If you were to count all the cells in the human body and took the number of bacterial cells versus the number of human ones, we would actually have more bacterial cells than human ones. Prokaryotes also help to recycle nutrients in the environment, processing our waste, they decompose dead things, and help plants grow. We even use prokaryotes to help make some of our favorite fermented foods like pickles and sauerkraut and yogurt. If all of the prokaryotes suddenly disappeared from the planet tomorrow, complex organisms like humans would no longer be able to survive. Once we know whether the organism is going to be a prokaryote or eukaryote, then we can begin classifying it in other ways. We start with the most inclusive at the domain level and get as specific as possible at the species level, which is going to be the least inclusive. For example, if you were writing a letter to a friend, the domain level grouping, that would be the country in which that letter needs to be delivered. It's going to be the most inclusive. And the species would be the exact house number or the least inclusive part of that letter's address. Now, there are going to be three domains of life: domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya. In some older textbooks, you may see domain bacteria called domain eubacteria or domain archaea called domain archaebacteria, but either way, both of those domains are going to have only prokaryotic organisms. Members of domain bacteria are what we refer to as our modern bacteria and contain species you're probably more familiar with, like Staphylococcus or E. coli. while domain archaea are known as the ancient ones because they resemble what we think the earliest prokaryotes were like. We find members of domain archaea in the most extreme places on Earth, like hydrothermal vents, swamps, and the super salty waters of the Dead Sea. Domain eukarya, on the other hand, is full of eukaryotes, and we're going to separate those eukaryotes into kingdoms, including kingdom Plantae, kingdom Animalia, kingdom Protista, and kingdom Fungi. Although the very first eukaryotes were unicellular, meaning their entire bodies consisted of just one cell, they really were more complex, and it set the stage for organization and functionality that would lead to the complex organisms we see today. This complexity set the evolutionary stage for future larger cells to evolve that were even more complex and would lead to the extremely complex multicellular organisms that you and I have turned into, as well as in Kingdom Plantae and Kingdom Fungi. Now, you've probably noticed by now that there isn't a domain for viruses, and that's because they don't pass the Is It Alive test. Viruses need a host cell in order to reproduce, meaning that they have no energy metabolism, they don't grow, they don't produce waste products by themselves. So even though they do have the ability to pass on genetic material in the form of nucleic acids and therefore do evolve, that's not enough to classify them as a living organism. Nevertheless, there are important components of ecosystems, and they really help to drive evolution, and viruses apply environmental pressures that interact with the evolutionary principle of survival of the fittest for even more complex organisms. Well, until next time, thank you for joining me on Exploring Environmental Biology.